Great, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. As Vicki said, I'm Marianne Motley, Director of the Report Card Project, and we are going to do a deeper dive into the report cards and talk about specifically the gap closing and then some of the other data that's going to be reported in future years. So third time around, same slide that I had at all the other presentations. This just kind of lays out the timeline. And, as you can see, the report cards are a multi-year work in progress. As we talked about in the last presentation, we don't actually begin using that college, career, workforce, and military readiness measure until 2024-25 school year. So there's a lot of work yet to do. And one of the things that we have yet to do is submit our amendment to our ESSA plan. So this plan was adopted by our State Board of Education. It was filed with the Joint Committee for Agency Rule Review. So as far as the state is concerned, this is what we want to do. This is our final plan, but we do have to submit an amendment to the federal government. That's something that we do as a condition to receive our federal Title I money. We have to have a plan on how we hold schools and districts accountable. This has not happened yet. We're hoping to get it out this week. We have been working with our federal counterparts, but there's always that chance that they could come back and say that something isn't going to meet their approval. So if that happens, we'd have to go back and figure things out. We're really hopeful that's not going to happen, but I've just kind of been putting that overarching caveat in there because I don't want people to come back and say, wait, you told me it was this way and now it's that way. And there are some things specifically in this calculation or this presentation today that may raise some scrutiny with the feds, and I'll go through them as we talk through. So again, our report card terminology, we've now got rated components only. We used to have measures that received measure grades that rolled up to a component that rolled up to that overall rating. Now only the components are going to be rated. We'll have a series of unrated measures. And then in some cases, we have what we call report only data. I think a lot of districts said that the report cards didn't tell the whole story about the good things they do with students. So the legislature put some additional report card data, things that help you tell your stories and things for your communities to review. So we'll talk through how this plays out. So our gap closing component, this is the piece that we originally created to deal with gaps for subgroups of students. There are 10 federally required subgroups. And one of the subgroups really is a super group, if you will, because it's all students in the school or all students in the district. Then there's 9 disaggregations of that. There are 6 racial categories. There's Black students, white students, Hispanic, multiracial, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Asian Pacific Islander. And then there are 3 other groups, students with disabilities, English learners, and economically disadvantaged, that we are required by federal law to disaggregate data for those 9 subgroups and the super group that includes all students. So for those different pieces, for academic achievement in English and math and academic progress in English and math, we will be disaggregating, as you see on the screen, for all of those 10 subgroups. We also have to disaggregate graduation by those 10 subgroups. Then we have 3 other pieces of the report card that were put into this measure. We have our chronic absenteeism indicator. Formerly was part of the indicators met, but that's no longer part of a rating. We use chronic absenteeism as what we call our other academic indicator, which means it's not something that specifically uses test results, but it's something that can affect a student's ability to perform well on tests. Obviously, students who are chronically absent, who miss chunks of school, as a rule, may not do as well on tests as they would otherwise do if they came to school every day. So we had to put this somewhere, and the legislature put it there. We also, per federal statute, have to look at English learner proficiency improvement. How well are schools and districts doing in helping students for whom English is not their native language to be able to read, write, speak, and listen to English, so that lack of understanding English is not a barrier to learning. And then finally, the other piece that they move that's purely a state piece is the gifted performance indicator. There's nothing in federal statute that breaks down into a gifted subgroup, but the state has deemed that important. And again, that used to be part of the indicators met measure, but because that's no longer rated, they wanted gifted performance to be rated or to somehow contribute to a rating on the report card. So they moved it here. So we will talk through each of these 8 pieces in some greater detail. Our State Board of Education had to come up with a rubric on how the ratings are going to be generated for this component. And so as you can see on the screen, each piece contributes a certain number of points up to a total of 75 possible. Now, one thing to understand is that we have minimum subgroup sizes. The law actually lays out that we only evaluate a subgroup, whether it's all students as a subgroup for one of these pieces, or any of the 10 federally required subgroups, or the gifted students, if there are at least 15 students. And we'll talk through this in more detail. But the end result is, because of the way that this calculation plays out and the fact that the things at the bottom of this table where you see the 10s, it's 1 point per subgroup that's evaluated. So if you don't have, for example, 15 American Indian or Alaskan Native students, which almost nobody in Ohio has, we just don't have a lot of students that identify with that group. Out in some of the, the Midwest and the Western, or the breadbasket states, and in the West, they have a lot of that. Obviously up in Alaska, they do. And so they don't, Alaskan and American Indian, we don't have a lot of those. So you may only have a total possible of 68 points or 57 points, depending on what your individual makeup and your level of diversity of your school or district is. So again, we'll talk through this in more details to help you understand. So like I said, the N size is 15. So you only get evaluated for something if you have 15 students. The other thing to understand, and again, we'll talk through this in more details, is that the gifted performance indicator, it used to roll up to a single status of met or not met. And the rule was you had to meet each piece of the gifted indicator to overall meet the gifted indicator. Now each piece is going to be calculated independently, which means that you can have points for each element. I think one of the things that people said was that it's really tough to keep all those balls in the air and to do everything perfectly to the level that was expected. So now you can get partial credit for this, for meeting 1 or 2 pieces of the indicator, not just having to meet all 3. And again, in order for each piece to be evaluated, you have to have 15 gifted students in that piece. And again, we'll talk through those in more detail, what that means. The other thing to understand is that these percentages for the ratings that I'm going to show you at the end of my presentation, this is a starting range. And the State Board of Education will be coming back to look at the data and look at the rubric in 1 year. This is a completely new calculation with all of these pieces in it. And so they set something that they thought would be a reasonable starting point, but they want to look at data and come back. So let's start by talking about English language arts achievement and math achievement. This is very similar to what we have had in the past. We're looking at the tests for English in grades 3 to 8. So kids are tested annually with an English test, whatever grade they're in, whatever class they're taking, they take that year's English test from 3rd to 8th grade. And then at the high school level, they take a 10th grade English test, which is ELA 2. What we do is we take all of the students in each of those subgroups across the school or across the district, and we take just those English tests that they took and create a performance index. Now, for those of you that were in my presentation on day 1, we talked about how the performance index is changing. And instead of having a perfect performance index of 120 points, we take the top 2% of districts or the top 2% of schools. That same calculation would be done here in terms of looking at you know, how many points did you earn and what percent of possible points did you earn in terms of, you know, a perfect performance index, if you will. But instead of using percentages, we're actually using PI scores for this. So that's a distinction, that the numbers that you're seeing on the screen are actual performance index scores, not the percent of possible points. So what we're proposing is to reset the goals. As you can see, we had a 2021 goal that ranged, you know, from the upper 60s into the upper 80s, depending on which subgroup we were looking at. That was something we had filed with the US Department of Education back in 2017-18 school year and got those goals approved. The actual performance was much lower. You know, it ranged from the low 50s up to the mid 80s, as you can see. And so we are asking to reset the baseline for this, to take those 2021 actual scores and use them as the base and then ramp them up slowly over the next decade. We actually have goals that go out through the 2030-31 school year. I didn't put them on the screen because obviously it would have made it really small. And, but this is one of the things that we're asking the feds to do, is to reset everything because of the pandemic and the change in achievement because of the learning loss from the pandemic. We're doing the same thing with math, and that math PI is calculated exactly the same way. We take those tests in grades 3 to 8, but then we have more tests at the high school level. So we've got integrated math 1 and 2, and then algebra 1 and geometry. So whatever grades, whatever subjects are included either in your school's data or your district's data would be calculated into a performance index. And again, we're asking to reset those goals. So for the achievement targets, a school or district can receive that full point only. In prior calculations, you could get some points for showing improvement, but because this is on a 1-point rubric, 1 point for each subgroup that meets those goals, we no longer are giving partial credit for any amount of improvement. You have to meet that goal that I had on the screen in order to earn the point for that subgroup. And as I said, a subgroup that has fewer than 15 accountable students would not contribute any points to that denominator. So we don't throw that 1 into the denominator of total possible points earned if you don't have 15 students. And most schools and districts have fewer than 10 subgroups. You know, if you look at your prior report cards, you'd be able to gauge, you know, roughly how many subgroups you're going to have. We did use the 15 last year. And so, you know, you're likely to have 4 to 5. So these would be the goals that each of those subgroups would be expected to meet for this year using, in this case, this is the English, and then again, using the math. So, and that's assuming that the federal government lets us reset these. You know, like I said, our leaders have been talking with the members of our counterparts in the federal government. So they think that this is all doable, which means that it would be a more realistic target given where the students were in the prior year. The tests, that 21 actual column, are based on the tests taken in the spring of the 2020-21 school year. So we also have English and math progress. And in the old calculation, you probably remember that if you didn't earn the maximum points for meeting the goal for English or math, then we looked at growth. And growth in the old calculation only helped you. Now it can both help and hurt because it's its own separate calculation. So they've completely divorced these two calculations from each other, and they're done separately. The subgroup calculations do use the same tests that I just mentioned for the performance index. So ELA is the grades 3 to 8 and ELA 2 for those schools or districts that have those grades. Obviously, Not all schools have all of those tests. And then for math, it's grades 3 to 8, integrated math 1 and 2, algebra 1 and geometry. So for those of you, again, that were in my day one presentation, we talked about a 2-step process that we're going to use for the progress component, where we do a growth index plus an effect size to assign star ratings. We are going to be doing that same calculation just so that you can see the data, but what's needed to meet the growth calculation is a 4-star rating, which means any growth index of +2 or higher, regardless of effect size, would meet the criteria to earn the point, that you would be considered to meet growth and earn that point for that subgroup. And again, only subgroups that have 15 or more accountable students would be evaluated. So this is what I had shown on day one, this slide. So anything in those 2 blue categories, any of the schools or districts where your growth index based on that first part of the calculation is a +2 or higher, would be considered to have met growth for the purpose of gap closing. And then this is the one for the districts. So the next piece of this is our graduation. And again, this is something that we've evaluated on since this was created back in 2003, since we had the original AYP, or adequate yearly progress calculation, going back almost 20 years now. So again, you've got each of your 10 subgroups. Any of the subgroups that have 15 students in the 4-year graduation rate. So because we lag our graduation rate, it's the class of 2021 evaluated on the 2022 report cards. Lagging it a year gives you the opportunity to count those summer graduates that otherwise wouldn't be earning a diploma until towards the end of August, for example, and we wouldn't have time to collect the data. And so that's why we lag that, so that in the summer of 21, anybody who graduated prior to the start of the 21-22 school year can also be included along with those normal traditional spring graduates. And again, we're looking at changing the graduation component and the numbers. Now, one of the things that you'll probably notice for this is that in a couple of cases, the graduation rates actually increased. So some of them were slightly down, such as the all students and the economic disadvantage. But then when you go down and look, for example, at English learners, at African Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, some of those categories have actually gone up a small percentage. And so because we were asking to reset the goals down, we also, have to ask to set them up if we're going to be using real data to set this, to make this request. So we did try to reset the goals for this year for graduation. And I see a question for progress. Is it only value-added tests for ELA? Yes, yes, it is ELA and math starting in 4th grade, Dave. Thank you for correcting that. It's 4th through 8th grade and then the high school tests. We do use the 3rd grade data, but that's the baseline data. So there isn't actually growth calculated for 3rd grade students. So with these goals, again, you can receive full points only, 1 point if you meet those graduation rates for the 4-year rate, and only subgroups where there's a 15 students or more would be evaluated. And so those would be the goals that you would have to meet for your class of 2021 for each of those 10 subgroups or whatever number of subgroups you have. So I'm going to stop and see, are there any questions on any of the English, math, or graduation? And thanks again, Dave. I will correct that to say 4th through 8th grade.
No problem. I just had a quick question as well, Marianne, around that progress piece. So I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that for progress, you're going to get 1 point if they meet the progress for ELA, and then 1 point if they meet the progress for math. Is that correct so far?
Yes.
Okay, so then is that when they just look at all students, or is that even broken down within the subgroups even more to where each of the subgroups is like 1/10 of a point that leads to the 1 point when it talks about progress?
It's 1 point per subgroup. So they can earn a total of up to 10 points. So let me go back to that slide. So for English and math growth,
Mhm.
there we go. It's 1 point per subgroup. So we'll evaluate all students in their growth. And if they get the 4 stars or higher, the +2 or higher, that would be 1 point. Then we'll say white students and do that evaluation for them, just using the tests from those students who identified as being white. And then
Okay,
we do the same thing as, Black, Hispanic, whatever subgroups you have that have at least 15 students in them.
okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So you could have 4 or 5 subgroups evaluated for growth. This, if you're a fairly diverse school or district, you may have, even 6 or 7. Most schools and districts don't have all 10. The Asian Pacific Islander and the American Indian, Alaskan Natives, there aren't as many schools and districts that have those 2, but a lot of them have, 5 or 6 at least. And a lot don't have the English learner either. But yeah, you could earn up to 10 points. It's 1 point per subgroup. And then the same thing for graduation. Each of those 10 subgroups is evaluated 1 point per subgroup.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
A couple more questions in the chat box,
Yeah.
Marianne.
Yep. Let's see. It says, will scores be adjusted if the school does not have all? Yes. The scores are adjusted in that you would not have all 75 points in that denominator. So when I show this on the screen here where it says 10, all these 10s down below here, that might say 8 or 7 or 6. And you might have different numbers of subgroups for different pieces of this. Because for graduation, you're only talking about kids in the class of 2021. It's basically 1 grade's worth of students. And so across the whole district, you may have 6 or 7 subgroups, because for the English and math, it's students that are taking tests. And so you're going to have, 3rd graders for achievement, taking tests, 4th graders, 5th graders, 6th graders, and so on. You're going to have, 6 or 7 years worth of students taking those tests, but you only have 1 year's worth graduating. So you may not have 15, multiracial students in a single grade, but you might have 15 across the whole district taking a test. So this could say 6 as the denominator or 5 as a denominator for any of these pieces, in which case the total possible points would be reduced. You might have 57 points or 37 points, depending on the size and level of diversity. And then somebody said, is it accurate to say that growth effect size has no impact on this phase? Yes, that's correct. The effect size does not have any bearing, because of the fact that it's just a +2 and higher. And you get to +2 just based on the growth index, where we take the growth divided by the standard error. So that effect size, that second calculation that differentiates between whether you get a 4-star rating or a 5-star rating, doesn't impact this piece. Both groups get credit equally for meeting this piece of the gap closing.
And then if you scroll up a little bit, there was also one from Rob.
Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. For students with disabilities, is it a 4-year graduation rate if the students graduate by the standard requirements? Yes, it is the standard requirements, the state requirements, if you will. So we would be looking at your graduation rate for any student who earns an Ohio diploma, regardless of whether they met a pathway to graduate open to all students, or if they graduated based on their IEP goals. So for these calculations, these rates will include those students with disabilities that graduated because their IEP team said that they met whatever it was on their IEP that they had to do because of their disability. And again, you know, the feds have said from time to time that they want states to start calculating it differently, but at least for now, we are able to count everybody in the state graduation rate, which would be the higher of the two, because you get credit for everybody who walks, everybody who gets that diploma by the end of the 4th year. All right, so I'll move on to the chronic absenteeism indicator. So previously, as I said, this was in the indicators met component. And so it's been moved to gap closing. And this one's a little bit different because you can meet this based on improvement. So, you know, remember in the old calculation, we had a chronic absentee goal. We had a percentage that you were expected to be at or below. In this case, lower is better instead of higher is better, like all the other things. And so you could meet the goal and meet the indicator, or you could show improvement from the prior year and also be considered to have met the indicator. So that meeting the indicator through improvement still continues to exist. But it's an all or nothing. On that screen that I just had, there it's 5 points for meeting the indicator, and there is no partial points. You don't get a 3 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5 or a 2 out of 5. So you either meet the indicator through either meeting the goal or showing improvement, or you don't meet it and you earn 0 out of 5 points. And this calculation is done for all students only. So we're not breaking it down into, you know, what was your chronic absenteeism percentage for your African Americans and your whites and your students with disabilities and so on. It's just of the kids in the school or of the kids in the district, what was their chronic absenteeism percentage? And just to refresh your memory, a student is deemed chronically absent if he or she misses at least 10% of the hours that they would be expected to be in school. And the way that we calculate this, any student who has 100 hours of possible attendance, so they've been enrolled in your school or enrolled in your district for at least 100 hours, which is roughly a month. You know, it's a little more, a little less, depending on the number of days and holidays and things like that, but it's roughly a month of school. And it's of those hours that they would have been expected to be in school, how many were they actually in school versus how many were they marked absent. And excused and unexcused are the same thing. They're all absences. So we create a percentage. Johnny was supposed to be there 1,000 hours. He was in attendance for 900. He missed 100 as an absence. So Johnny was in attendance 90% of the time. He was absent 10% of the time. We do that for each student. So the first part of the calculation is done student by student. And if a student's only there part of the year, maybe they were enrolled for 500 hours instead of, you know, 1,000 hours, then it's of those 500 that they would have been expected to be in attendance for you, how many were they actually in attendance? So a student who was not engaged at a prior school does not impact your rate, and your rate does not impact any place that the student might transfer later in the year or come from earlier in the year. So it's just based on what type of attendance did the student have with you. And again, to be included, a student must have 100 possible hours of attendance or more. So we calculate it for each student, and each student gets a label of either chronically absent or not chronically absent based on that 10%. If they've missed at least 10% of the school year, they're labeled chronically absent. If it's something less than 10% of the hours that they missed, they're not chronically absent. Then we calculate how many students got the label of chronically absent. And that's what the percentage is that you see on the screen there. So I had 22% of my kids that were chronically absent. I would meet the indicator because anything at 22.1 or lower, in this case, it's lower, not higher, remember that, is meeting the indicator outright. And again, we've reset these indicators. So, and I did put all of them on the screen because this was the only place that I could really do it and keep them at a decent size. But as you can see, the actual rate of chronic absenteeism last year was 24%. So we are ramping it down such that we would expect to get to 5% now by the 2030-31 school year. Remember, originally we were going to get to that 5% in the 25-26 school year. So we've taken this out something like 5 more school years from where we were originally expecting to get to 5%. Then the pathway to show improvement stays the same. If you're something higher than 22.1, you can still meet the indicator and earn those 5 points if you've either reduced between 2021 and 22, those 2 chronic absenteeism percentages, if you've made a reduction of 3% or 1.1 percentage points, whichever is smaller. And you can do the smaller of the 2. And the way that this works is if you had a chronic absenteeism percentage of 36.7, they're exactly the same because 3% of 36.7 is exactly 1.1 percentage points. So if you're higher than that, the smaller of the 2 is that to reduce it by 1.1 percentage points. If it's lower than 36.7, 3% is the smaller of the 2. So any questions on chronic absenteeism? And like I said, we have not changed the business rules for who's included in this, how this is calculated, and what you need to do to meet this piece of gap closing. It's just that it was picked up and moved into this calculation. And if you meet, you get those 5 points added to your numerator in addition to the 5 points added to the denominator. All right, so the next piece we'll talk through is our English Learner Proficiency Improvement Indicator. And again, this was something that we added back in 2017-18. And before I get started, I have a question here. It says, is it accurate to say that there's no longer credit or acknowledgement at all for improvement on tests in the revised report card? Yes, I mean, for the most part, that's correct. The law took a lot of that credit for improvement out, both in the indicators met. We are getting rid of the improvement indicator, the end of course improvement indicator, or the retake indicator as people called it. And we also did take away, the law took away, it wasn't ODE, the law took away partial credit for showing improvement on the PI score here in the gap closing component. So yes, it's much more driven towards meeting the standard or not, and evaluating how many standards are met. So thank you for that. So our English Learner Proficiency Improvement Indicator. This also can be met through improvement. So we'll talk through, kids, this uses our OELPA test, our Ohio English Language Proficiency Assessment. When a student's identified as an English learner, they have to take that test once a year. Usually it's taken in the spring, and it's a 4-part test. There's a reading section that measures how well they can read English, a writing section, a listening section, and a speaking section. And they take it over 4 different days usually, so that the kids don't get too stressed out and having to think and perform in English that's not their native language. So it's given, over multiple sessions. And for each of those pieces, they get a score between 1 and 5. So based on how well they do whatever it is, listening, speaking, and so on, they get a proficiency level. The first year they take that test, they get what we call a baseline. And they could have all 1s, if they don't know a word of English, if they're just coming over here and they've not been exposed in wherever their home country is, then, it's not unusual to get straight 1s. on this test. And that's okay. I mean, you know, if I went over to most foreign countries, I'd get straight ones on their tests too. So that's acceptable. From that test, we look at whether they need to show one number of improvement or two numbers of improvement. So we sum the tests. So if they got a 1 times 4 tests, they'd have 4 points. They would be expected to show a certain amount of improvement between the first year they tested and the second year. They, you know, another way to say it is they would have been expected to at least learn a little bit of English somewhere in some of those domains. So they come back the second year and they take that same OELPA test 1 year later. It's scored again exactly the same way, and we sum those numbers. So in my example, if they had gotten, say, 6 points, maybe they still had a 1 for writing and speaking, but the listening and reading, they now had 2s. They would be showing improvement. So again, this is a calculation done initially student by student. And every year they come back and they're expected to make improvement. The third year they take the test, they should have a few more points. The fourth year they have more points, and so on. And eventually the goal is to get enough points on that test that they exit as an English learner. They've gotten to that level where they're proficient, and they reach proficiency once they have all 4s or a combination of 4s and 5s on those 4 tests. So nothing's at a 3 or lower. And then they can exit EL status. And what that basically means is that presumably English is no longer a barrier to learning. You know, it doesn't mean they're going to be stellar students or that they're not going to have other barriers, but at least language is not a barrier, and their inability to understand English would not be a barrier. So when we do this calculation, we do it student by student, and then we sum how many kids had made improvement from 1 year to the next. So how many students that had a 4 now have a 6? How many students that had a 7 now have a 9? You know, or how many students who had a 13 now had a 14 across those 4 domains? And so you can either meet the improvement through making reaching the goal, or you can have improvement of 10% from 1 year to the next. And these are the goals. So if you have at least 43.05% of your students showing improvement from 1 year to the next, you would meet the goal. Or if you're something lower than that, say you only had 30%, we would look at your calculation between 2021 and 2022 and see, did you make at least a 10% improvement? And it's 10%, not 10 percentage points. So 10% of 30 is 3. So if you were at 30% last year, you'd need to be at 33% this year to meet the English learner improvement. So the other thing to understand with this is that this is done for all English learners only. So we don't break it down, for example, into Hispanic English learners and African American English learners and American Indian English learners. It's just of the kids who are deemed English learners, regardless of what other characteristics they have, are they making improvement? And you also get credit for any students who exit their EL status when we're looking at that, whether you hit that 43.05% target. And again, these goals have been reduced. We were expected to get to the 75% showing improvement by the 25-26 school year. So we've ramped this out another 5 school years. So any questions on the English learner improvement calculation before I move on to gifted? All right. So our gifted indicator, the law, as I said, this is something purely created in state law. We have, a very strong gifted lobby group, And we are one of the few states that actually has a gifted performance indicator and uses gifted students as a subgroup. The gifted this is made up of 3 different pieces. And as I said, they're all calculated separately now. So you used to only get credit for meeting the gifted indicator if you kept all 3 of those balls balanced in the air and you met all 3 pieces. Now you can earn partial points. As you could see on that slide, each of these pieces earns a possible 5 points if you have at least 15 students evaluated. And so you can earn 0, 5, 10, or 15, depending on what you meet and where you have 15 students. So we've got a gifted performance index, gifted progress, and gifted identification and services, just like we had in the old indicator. And I'll talk through each of these in a little detail. So let's talk about the gifted performance index. The gifted PI score is using that same calculation that we use for the regular performance index. And for those of you that were here on day 1, remember I talked about how we take the top 2%. So we calculate a performance index score. In this case, we're using gifted students and the tests that match their gifted identification. So if a student is math gifted, we would throw whatever math test he took into that gifted PI. A student who's reading gifted, we'd throw their English test in. Science gifted, any science tests they take. Social studies gifted, it would either be American history or American government. The PI score itself is calculated exactly like we do for the regular performance index that I talked about on day 1, where you get the different weights, you get credit for students who are on a formal acceleration plan, counting 1 level higher. And once the performance index is calculated, we rank from the absolute highest PI score down to the lowest. We calculate how many schools or districts are make up the top 2%. So if there would be 100 schools that had a PI, the top 2% would be the top 2 schools. We take an average of those 2 performance indexes in my example, and that becomes a perfect PI. And so that's the standard against which everybody is then compared. And you have to earn, to meet this piece of the indicator, you have to earn at least 95% of the possible points. So again, and there will be 2 different max scores, one for school buildings, one for school districts. So if you earn at least 95% of the possible points, you would meet this piece of the indicator. And as you can see on the screen, this is a target that increases. Our state board felt that 95% was a good starting point, but that it should be increased over the next 2 years to 96.5 and then 97.5. So very aggressive. And it's likely, looking at the data, that the top 2% are probably going to be exceeding 120 points. If you think about it, because a lot of the kids who are gifted are also accelerated. That's one way that they can serve a student so that he's not bored and you know, if he's just working way above grade level in that subject where he's gifted, they can put him in some more difficult coursework and make it challenging for him. So, and those kids tend to perform very well on tests. So you're going to have some kids that are in that advanced plus range, you know, earning the 1.3 points for that percent of tests. So it's possible that it could exceed 120 points. For our gifted progress, again, we're calculating this exactly the same way that we did for our traditional value added and for the value added that I just talked about for gap closing. But we're only throwing in the tests, again, that meet the gifted type. So if a student is reading gifted, we use an English test and would calculate an English gain. If he's math gifted, we use the math test and would calculate a math gain. And in order to receive a MET for this piece, they need to earn at least 3 stars. The three-star, 4-star, 5-star rating would identify that student, would allow you to meet this piece. 3 stars, again, going back to that slide that I had, is anything at -2 for a gain index and higher, regardless of effect size. So this is another piece, although we are using that 2-step process so that you can see things on the diagnostic reports, that you can use this for diagnostic purposes just to see where that group would have fallen across that 1 to 5 continuum. We really are only using that first step to calculate, and anything that's -2 or higher would be in the 3-star range or higher. And again, there we are looking at the districts. So then we get into the gifted identification and services, the inputs calculation of the old calculation. This is calculated again very similarly to the way it was calculated in the old calculation, where we have a matrix, and for every student that you identify, for every student that you serve, you earn points for this piece of the calculation. And I want to differentiate between the points earned for this and those 5 points earned for the component, for the piece of the calculation. So at the very end, if you meet the indicator for identification and service, you contribute 5 points to your gap closing component. But then within the identification and service, when we're saying, did you meet identification and services, yes or no, that can earn up to 140 points. So it's kind of points to earn points. So we'll talk through it kind of slowly. So for this piece, more is better. I mean, just like in the old calculation, if you have more students identified, if you're serving more students, you earn more points. There are for districts, there are 16 separate percentages that factor into this. Schools have 8 calculations that factor in and help you earn points. The maximum total points you can earn is 140. But again, because of the fact that you have to have at least 15 students to have a calculation done, you may not have all 8 or 16 calculations. So for identification and service, for the superior cognitive and specific academic identifications, we continue to break students down by grade band. We had a work group that put this rubric together, and they felt very strongly that students should be identified early in their childhood, early in primary school. And so they wanted to break it down by grade band. And as you can see, they changed the grade bands a little bit. It used to be that we had an elementary and middle school and a high school grade band. And so now we're breaking it down into the primary grades, the intermediate grades, middle school and high school. So it's a K2, 3, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 12 grade band. And for identification, each of these calculations is, of the students in that grade band, how many were identified as gifted? What percentage of those total enrollment were identified as gifted? So if I have 100 kids in K-2, how many of my 100 kindergarten through 2nd graders did I identify as either being superior cognitive or one of the 4 specific academic identifications: reading, math, science, social studies? And students, any student that's identified as any of those 5 types of gifted would count in the numerator as having been identified. Students who have multiple identifications are not weighted more heavily. Every student's a 1 in the numerator, regardless of how many times they're identified. So the denominator for each of that calculation is the overall total enrollment in that grade band. The numerator is the number of students who have at least one of those identifications. And again, this is done at the district level. For schools, it's just of the school, of the kids in the school. the total enrollment of the school, how many kids have one of those 5 identifications. So the school calculation doesn't break it down by grade band, because the grade bands would vary dramatically. You know, some schools are kindergarten only, some are K-8 and everything in between. Some are K-12 and everything in between. So a difference in the calculation between the old one and the new one is the creativity and visual and performing arts. And so for that, in the old calculation, we did the same disaggregation by grade band at the district level. What we found was that so few students are identified in any grade band that a lot of times the calculation itself didn't work, and it wouldn't work given that 15 student requirement. So for that, we're now moving to a K-12. So of the students in your school, or of the students in your district across all the grades served in the school or K-12 in the district, how many did you identify either as being creative gifted or visual or performing arts gifted? So, and I have a question here. You mentioned that the student with an ELA ID would count in the ELA data. What about a student who only has cognitive ID? Are they counted in every tested area? Yes, we would throw in the test for both the performance index and the value added calculation. We would include all tests taken, every subject's test taken for students who are superior cognitive. Thank you, Carrie, for that. So for the identification, like I said, it's of the enrollment, how many are identified. For service, it's of the identified students, what percent of those students are served. So again, of your K2 students, I had 100 total students in my K2 grade band. I identified 20 kids as gifted. Of those 20 identified students, how many of them am I serving? And we do that again for each of the 4 grade bands at the district level. And then K-12 for the creativity and visual and performing arts. Of my kids identified as creative thinking or visual and performing arts gifted, how many of them are served? Then we have 2 additional calculations. In the old calculation, we calculated percentages of students who were minorities or students who were economically disadvantaged. And we did a similar calculation for identification and service. For this, we do a little bit different calculation for the new report cards. We do something called a representation index, and I'll talk about that in a second. So a couple of changes for the minority calculation. The law actually stresses that it's underrepresented minorities in this particular subgroup. So we're supposed to be looking at, of the kids who are traditionally underrepresented as far as the gifted population goes, how many of those are you identifying and serving? And so when we looked at data, Asian students are identified actually at a higher rate than white students. And so Asians are not underrepresented in the gifted population. So they are not included in this subgroup. So Pacific Islanders, in the other parts of gap closing, Pacific Islanders are lumped in with Asians to make one big subgroup. So it's both the students sort of that come from the Asian mainland countries, like China, Japan, countries like that, Vietnam. And then you've got Pacific Islanders that tend to come, from places like, the Philippines, Guam. I guess technically Japan is an island or a series of islands. And so for that, we're taking out those students who identify as Pacific Islander and including them along with the other 4 subgroups. So the African American, Hispanic, multiracial, and the American Indian, Alaskan Native subgroups to make one big group of students that includes all of the students in that type. So one of the things I've been trying to tell schools and districts is that when you're identifying your students as Asian or Pacific Islander, that's going to become a little more important to differentiate because of the fact that we include the Pacific Islanders in this. So we create these subgroups, and then the other subgroup is your economically disadvantaged students. And that's done exactly like we do it for that subgroup is the same students that would be identified for the other pieces of the gap closing for the English and math, achievement and growth and graduation. So once we've got our subgroups identified and we find out that we have at least 15 students, and for the minority, it's 15 across all of the minorities. You don't need 15 in each of those individual minority groups. So you could have 3 that are Pacific Islander, 5 that are African American, and so on. As long as the total number equals 15 or more, they would be evaluated. So then we calculate a representation index. And the representation index is the ratio between a given student group's representation, in this case in the gifted population, and their representation in the overall student population. So how many of that subgroup is gifted compared to how many in that subgroup is in the overall population of your school or district. And so a representation index, an index of 1.0 indicates perfect proportionality, and anything less than 0.8, statisticians will call that inequitable services or inequitable identification. And so the way that this works, it's a multi-step process, and we take the final numbers from each step. So let's just say that my school district has an enrollment of 1,000 students. K to 12, I have 1,000 kids. Of my 1,000 students, 200 are identified as economically disadvantaged. And we can also sub in 200 are identified as being in those, across those various racial subgroups. So I have a 20% identification in that subgroup. So 20% of my students are disadvantaged. Or again, if I'm looking at those minority groups, 20% of my students are in those in that underrepresented minority group. Then we put that calculation aside from step 2, and we move to step 3. Then we look at how many of my kids are gifted. So out of my, again, you go back to that 1,000 students. Of my 1,000 students, I have 300 gifted students. And of my 300 gifted students, 25 are disadvantaged. Or again, you could say 25 are in those underrepresented minority groups. So I have 8% of my gifted kids are in that disadvantaged or minority group. So I put that calculation aside and I take those two numbers, the 8% and the 20%, and I make a ratio. So I have an 8% representation in my, say, economically disadvantaged or minority group among my gifted population, but they represent 20% in my total enrollment. So my ratio is 0.4. And then I plug that into the table to figure out how many points I earn. And I do that for each piece, once for identification, once for service. And I do it, once for the minority group, once for the economically disadvantaged. And I earn points for equitable identification and equitable service. So once we do each of these calculations, we award a total number of points for this piece of the component. And you can see on the screen, this is for districts, and these are the number of points you get for identification. So basically, if you identify any students in any of those grade bands, you're going to earn at least 1 point for this piece of the calculation. If as you identify more students, you earn more points. And one thing I want to point out is the numbers for the K2 grade band are different than the numbers for the other 3 grade bands in each of these. The band on the left or the boxes on the left are for identification, and then the boxes on the right are percent served. So if I identify 10% of the K2 grade band, again, I have 100 students in my K2 in grades K-2 in my district. If I identify 10 students, I've reached that 10% goal, I earn the maximum points. For all the other 3 grade bands, I have to identify 15% of my students in order to earn the maximum points. And I only earn 5 points for each of them, whereas I get 15 points at the K2. This is to create some strong incentives to identify kids early. And then you see the same thing at the service area. There's a little bit different there in that you earn 4 points for serving 10% of your K2 students. For all the others, you have to serve 20 points in order to earn those 20% in order to earn those 4 points. And I see a question. What is there are not, what if there are not 10 gifted students out of 100 in your school? Well, if you don't have those, I mean, obviously these are for the academic and superior cognitive, these are objective tests. I mean, basically you're giving them a standardized test that's used for that subject or to identify superior cognitive, overall superior IQ. And if they don't meet the criteria to be deemed gifted, I don't know that there's anything that you can do to move that needle. Obviously serving students to make sure that they reach their fullest potential is something that you can focus on. But, my understanding is you can't make a student who's not gifted. I mean, they are objective tests and they either have to meet the required score, which is 2 standard deviations above the mean, roughly the 95th percentile in layman's terms, or they don't qualify. So yeah, I don't know that there's anything that you can do if a student just clearly isn't functioning at that level to make them meet. One thing you can do for each of your students that are identified is focus on getting points for service and making that a priority. And again, I know it's real easy to sit here in Columbus, Ohio and say that. I know you've got a lot of kids that you've got to serve and you've got limited resources, both staff and funding. But to the extent possible, focus on serving as many kids as you can. Because again, you earn the maximum points at each of those grade bands for this once you get to 80% service. So that's, I guess, the best advice I can tell you. I know that our gifted team will provide support. And yeah, I understand you're looking at the logic of it. You can't, again, my understanding is you can't just move that needle beyond a certain point. But I know, if you have concerns, that we do have some people that are experts in this particular area that can make sure that the kids are getting their fullest potential. So if they are gifted, but they're just not reaching that level, they may be able to give you some tips on how to help them get to that level that they would be identified. So this is the rubric for the creative thinking and fine arts. And again, these are similar. You see the 10% there. So it's not as aggressive of a goal, but you also don't earn as many points. And you get the same points for the percentages of service that you did over on the other page. And then for the representation indexes, you've got one there on the left for identification and service for economic disadvantaged students, and one for the underrepresented minority students. And again, to get to that maximum points, you have to identify at a level that represents basically an 80%. That index can be equated to a percent, and it's basically you're identifying about 80% of the students comparatively to how they are represented in the overall population. And then the same thing for services. If you're serving 80% of them, you get the maximum points. And again, you only have this, and you only get these points added to your denominator if you otherwise have 15 students or more in those types. So one of the big takeaways from the last calculation was it was a base of 100 points. So what percent of 100 points did you earn? And you didn't get evaluated for economic disadvantage or minority if you didn't have those students. Now, and so it was sort of throwing those points into the denominator and not giving you any opportunity to earn points in the numerator. Now, you only have those 20 or 10 points that you see, the maximums, added to the denominator if you otherwise have enough students to evaluate. So instead of having the full 100 points, you might only have 100 points, or again, or 80 points or something like that. So it doesn't hurt you if you don't have 15. And then these are the rubrics for the buildings. And it's basically the same percentages. It's just that because we aren't breaking it down by grade band, the academic, there's more points earned for the same percentages. And then everything else is exactly the same. So in order to meet this piece of the indicator and earn those 5 points for the gap closing component, you need to earn 60% of your possible points in 21-22, and then 70% and then 80%. So this is another piece that ramps up across the next 2 school years. So this is a starting point. So once again, to go back, each of these pieces is evaluated on its own if you have the 15 students. And if you do, and for identification and services, you would have 15 if you have at least identification, which everybody's going to have that piece because it's of the kids in your school or of the kids in the grade band within your district, and everybody has at least 15. You know, I'm not aware of any buildings that are going to have less than 15 students. So progress and performance index you may or may not have. So again, once each of these pieces is evaluated, we come up with a total number of possible points that you could have earned. And again, most schools and districts are going to have fewer than those 10 subgroups. And some schools and districts won't have some of the other things. You might not have English learner proficiency if you don't have a lot of ELs in your school or district. If you're not a high school, you're not going to have graduation. If you don't have a lot of students, again, if you're a K-2 school, you wouldn't have a gifted performance index or gifted progress unless you have accelerated students. You may have a gifted PI if enough kids are accelerated to 3rd grade, but you wouldn't have progress if you don't have 4th grade or higher. And so, you know, you'll have some number of points. And we'll calculate a percent of your possible points. And that becomes your preliminary percentage. Then we have to bring participation, as if this didn't get, isn't already complicated enough. We have to add participation into the mix. And again, this is federal. The feds are very adamant that they want schools and districts to test all students, and that they want these calculations to be based on the overwhelming majority. So they have set up a 95% participation rate. Basically, they say, you know, there has to be some kind of a penalty if you don't test at least 95% of your students and 95% in each subgroup. So we're looking at making a little bit of a change. The law changed to say that the penalty that we give to you has to be in proportion to the amount by which the 95% goal is missed. So if you remember correctly, in the last calculation, we dropped you by 1 letter grade if you missed 95%, even if you missed by 1 student. So, you know, there were some schools that only tested 70%, There were some schools that tested 94.999%, and they each lost a letter grade. So the law changed at the state level to say that that penalty has to be proportional to the amount by which it's missed. And so we're going to change the calculation, and we're going to run it by the feds and hope that they accept this. So what we're doing, again, we come up with this preliminary amount of points. So let's just say my school earned 55 out of a possible 75. Then we look at all students only. We're going to report participation percentages for each of the 10 subgroups, but we're only going to do this calculation based on the all students group. So of the kids in my school who should have taken an English test, or of the kids in my school or district who should have taken a math test, how many actually took those tests? So if I had 100 students in my school who should have taken English and I had 96 tests taken, for that, I would have met, if it was just calculated on English alone, I'd have met the 95% participation rate because 96 out of 100 tested. But what we're doing is we're combining it. So I also look at my kids for math. Of my 100 kids who should have taken a math test, only 92 tested. So I combine those two numerators, combine those two denominators. I should have had 200 tests taken. I actually had 188 taken. So my participation rate is 94%. 188 out of 200 gives me a 94% participation rate. Then I make a ratio to see how close did I come to meeting the 95%. So I came, I guess the best way to say it is I came 94 out of 95, 94ths of the 95th way there, or 98% of 0.9% of the way there. So I make that ratio. So what I do then is I take that 98.9% and I multiply that by my 55 points earned. And my final rating is based on 98.9% of the possible points. So I get a 54.4 out of 75. So I would be rated in this particular calculation as a 4-star rating. And again, this whole calculation is brand new. This proposal of combining English and math, only doing it for the all students group. That's not how we've done it in the past. And so we have to hope that the feds will accept this. And again, our leaders seem to think that this will meet the letter of the law and that they'll accept it. So once I get that final percent of possible points earned, I plug it into this rubric and award my star rating. And again, we showed the state board data, and this is the data that they looked at. And as you can see, it's a fairly normal curve, a little bit skewed to the high side, a little more A's or a little more 5 stars rather than 1 stars. So this is the proposal that they put for this current school year. They are going to go back after we have data from the 2022 report cards and review these percentages to see if they should keep them and hold them steady, or if they should change them up or down. But this is where we started, at least for this year. And then again, for those of you that were in prior presentations, we have to put a label to explain what does it mean to get each of these star ratings to help the public understand. So this is what we have. So any questions on any aspect of the gap closing before we move on and talk about the overall rating and some other data that will be reported? All right, I'm not seeing anything. So I'll go ahead and start to move on. And if other questions come up, feel free to throw them in the chat. So our overall ratings don't get published till next school year, but we do have to use the data this year, both for sponsor evaluations for community schools, and this is the year, unless we get dispensation from the feds, that we have to go back and do our federal school improvement, where we have to identify focus and priority schools. Our overall ratings will include half stars, whereas each of the components that I've gone through the last 3 days only have full star ratings. And the components are weighted in state law. So what the law says is that until that 2024-25 school year, remember from the very first slide or second slide that I showed, when the college, career, workforce, and military readiness component comes on, the weighting is that achievement and progress are equally weighted. Graduation, early literacy, and gap closing are equally weighted. And eventually the CCWM will be weighted identical to those 3. And each of those have to be half the weight given to achievement. So this is what it looks like. And while we have 5 components possible, these are the ratios. And again, schools will have different ratios because if you're not a high school, you don't have graduation. If you don't have grades K to 3, you don't have early literacy. You may not have progress if you're only a K3 school, and so on. So the way that it works is exactly the same as we had in the old report card system, where each of those star ratings are turned into points. So if you have a high 4-star, you get 4 points. Medium high is 3 3/4. Medium low is 3.5. Low 4 stars is 3 1/4. We multiply those points based, each of the components is going to have a scale just like this on the screen based on where their cut points are for each of the star ratings. And we multiply those points times that percent to get weighted points. And we sum those weighted points across each of the components to get an overall number of points earned. And we plug it into this table to get the overall rating. So this really, the grade scales, the rating scales have changed, but the way that the points are assigned and the final calculation is done exactly as it was under the old letter grade report card. It's just that each of these scales has changed. And the fact that we're adding the half-star ratings here, we're cutting those percentages in half. So the overall, you're a 4.5 and a 5 from 4.125 and higher. That's exactly where the 5-star rating used to be. We're just splitting that in half. The same thing with the 4-star, the 3-star, and so on. There is nothing less than 1 full star, though. And then again, our state board looked at data, and this is the data that they looked at to show the distribution and how many letter grades were assigned versus the star ratings. And then finally, we have to do those descriptors again, starting next year for the overall ratings. And that's what you'll see on your report card. So any questions on the overall grade before I move quickly to talk about some report only data that will start showing up on the report cards? All right. So again, the law included a lot of new data that has to be reported, some of which we already have, and it's just codifying it in the law, and some of which will be brand new. So here are a couple examples. The PBIS data, the Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports Framework. We already have this on the report card, whether your school or district as a whole have implemented that framework. We have to continue to display it. And then a new piece of data that will start to come on is the number and percent of seniors who have completed the FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. So that'll be a new piece of data that will show how many kids are completing that. Starting next year, we have to do a whole student opportunity profile. Some of these data will be changed. They are on the report cards today, but in a different way. Some of them will be brand new. So for example, we have to start to put the average ratio of teachers to students. So 1 teacher for every 17.5 students, or 1 teacher for 22.7 students. Right now, we show the total number of teachers of record and then the number per 1,000 students. So this will be a different ratio, the same data. Same thing for counselors, school nurses, and some other professionals. One thing that will be changing It's the average ratio of licensed librarians and library media specialists. Right now, we're also including in the data that we have on librarians and library media specialists, we're including library aides and other people who are functioning in the role of a librarian. Primarily, they do that at the elementary schools in bigger districts. They may supplement, have one licensed librarian and several library aides, for example. So the moving forward, because of the way this is written, it's licensed, and library aides are not licensed. So some of these are still, we're in the process of developing. Some of these, again, the percent of teachers with fewer than 3 years experience is already on the report card, and principals. That's federally required data. It's just also now codified at the state level. Same thing with teachers who are not teaching in their subject or field for which they're certified or licensed. That's federal data. Then we've got a lot of information on students. They want us to report the percent of students that are enrolled in all-day K, the percent of kids that are taking a phys ed or wellness course, kids participating in co-curricular activities. That's something we actually tried to put on the report card, gosh, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and it was promptly pulled off. And one of the reasons it was pulled off was we had a lot of complaints that it's not real accurate because it wasn't something that was rated or graded. They don't always pay attention. And at that point, what we were doing was putting a list of the types of activities that students were participating in. And we had a complaint from one of the high schools where that school district had won the High School Athletic Association football championship for their division, and they didn't have football listed as an extracurricular activity. And so we had taken that off because they were concerned about the lack of accuracy or the inaccuracy of that data. So that's something to start thinking about, that we have to put the percent of students participating in these activities. So if you do have kids participating in something, you want to make sure they have the program codes, so that they get picked up starting next year and are reported accurately. We also have to put the percent of students participating in school breakfast programs and the percent transported by bus. Those two are usually pretty accurate. There's funding attached to them. And so, that gets a lot of scrutiny. Then we have to put course data. They want us to show, for example, the percent enrolled in a world language, percent enrolled in career tech, percent participating in advanced placement or IB honors courses, some kind of advanced coursework, percent of students identified as gifted, different types of gifted, and that gifted piece is already on the report card. The percent of students participating in enrichment or support programs outside the normal day, and finally, the ratio of portable technology devices, things like Chromebooks, laptops, that students can take home to the number of students in the class or in the school. So again, some new data. These things are all required to be reported, but we know, again, a lot of the advanced coursework doesn't get classified as advanced level coursework. So schools don't code their courses as being the AP or IB version of the course. They just report American history, not AP American history. Or an honors English class gets coded just as 10th grade English, not honors 10th grade. So that's something to start to think about for the upcoming school year. The enrichment and support programs, the support programs tend to be pretty accurate because, again, those are things that a lot of times you have to account for things like Title I, or because students are on a reading improvement and monitoring plan. The enrichment programs, it depends on the school district. Normally you're funded a certain amount, and I know they've changed how gifted is funded and how enrichment is funded. So that's becoming, I think, a little more accurate. So as we wrap up, I think I told you in the other presentations, our state board approved these rules, and they were filed with the Joint Committee for Agency Rule Review. We are in the process of doing that amendment to the Every Student Succeeds plan, And we are rolling out communications plans like what I've just done. We're also updating our reports in our secure data center. You know, there were a lot of changes I talked about over the last 3 days, and it means that some of these pretty reports may not be ready. So what we're recommending is that you look at what we call the reports for analysis as you're looking at checking your data to make sure that it's accurate. Those reports show data behind the calculation that's used to calculate the percent or now the rating. And so those were individual reports rather than that local report card report are going to have data in there now for most of these elements that we've talked about over the course of 3 days. So that's my contact information, and I'll take any last questions if you have questions on anything that I've presented on.